So the title is not clickbait. I actually wrote my HBS application in 1 month. So when I tell people this, they usually ask why and how. So I'll answer those questions today. So the reason why is because I genuinely love my job. I'm a robotics engineer at a large chemical company, and you might be wondering, why does a chemical company need a robotics engineer? Well, our processes are very old, and we have a lot of legacy equipment that needs to be maintained and inspected. So we want robots to do that instead of putting people in harm's way. So the point of robots is to do the dangerous, dirty, and dull work. And I get to play with robots every day, and that is really awesome. But in November, I realized that in order to grow, I would probably have to leave my department due to a bunch of politics. There was just not enough room for me to grow. So I talked to my mentors and my leaders, and we decided that applying for business school might be a good path forward. At first, I just planned to apply to some local programs that were online during the weekend or part time, but when my leader suggested I look into full time programs, I wasn't immediately receptive. I told him, look, I'm an engineer, I'm risk adverse, I don't really like the idea of quitting my job and sacrificing my income to go to school for a few years. That just doesn't quite make sense to me. But he's told me, look, where you're going, a MBA might be worth it for you. And I see it now that in his lens, I had already won a like company wide award for some of the work that I did, as well as an industry wide award for the Industry 4.0 work that my job falls into. So I took his advice and I thought about it, and I brought it to one of my other mentors, and she told me, look, you're so young, or you're too young to not invest in yourself. So I took those two pieces of advice, and I ran with it. I decided, I was going to apply for some MBA programs, and now I had to figure out how. So this is the fun part, how I applied in 1 month. So I didn't have a lot of time, so I couldn't really ask a lot of people about their experience or their process or how to do it. In fact, 1 month isn't even enough time to hire a consultant. But coming from a non-traditional business background, I didn't even know you could hire a consultant for this. So I consulted ChatGPT. I asked ChatGPT all about the application process, what schools there were, how they were ranked, the different costs, because I had to evaluate the ROI and what each school prioritized in their applicants. And this was extremely important because well, in my job, I do a lot of stakeholder alignment, and projects only are successful when the stakeholders are aligned. So, in my mind, I was doing a stakeholder alignment assessment, trying to figure out how my goals and priorities aligned with each school. And at the end, I chose two schools to apply to. I only applied to HBS and Wharton. And the reasons why are, again, because of ROI. I figured that I would either go big or stay home. If I didn't get into a big program, then I would just apply and go to a local program. And I had always wanted to live in New England. So that's why I didn't apply to Stanford. The next step is I watched a ton of YouTube. Because I couldn't talk to anybody, at least I could watch these, brilliant creators talk about their experience. So I'm not going to regurgitate all of the advice that I heard, but I will cite my sources. I watched a lot of Career and MBA Protocol with Angela Guido, as well as Tiger Sisters with Cherie and Jean, Rare Liquid with Ben, and Pooja. I'll put her name on the screen because I don't want to mess up her last name. Pooja's videos were actually extremely helpful to me. She walked through her work process and even revealed her essays. So it gave me some reference point as to how good my essays had to be in order to get into these top schools. I was also able to take her work process and compress it into 1 month. So you'll see that my work process very similarly reflects hers and what she shared. And lastly, she also inspired me to share my essays if I was successful. So in a later video, I will do that. But I wanted to kind of talk about the background and work process first. So what I did was I spent a week, which at this point that was like 25 to 30% of the time I had left, just reflecting and thinking about, my childhood, my life, and what I wanted the admissions committee to know. The schools made it pretty clear what they were looking for. Like for HBS, they wanted, business minded, leadership focused, and growth oriented. And for Wharton, they wanted to know what kind of impact you were going to make, in general. So they made it very clear. And so I, thought of stories that kind of illustrated those qualities in myself. And then after coming up with 10 to 12 stories, I just began to write. And I wrote and wrote and wrote. I didn't care about the word limit. HBS's word limit was pretty small, like I think 300 words for the business minded one and 250 for the other two essays. But I knew that it was going to be easier to work with a lot more content than, just a little bit of content. So the essays changed a lot between the first draft and, like, I don't know, the 20th or 30th draft. So it's okay if your first idea doesn't pan out and you have to pivot, because I definitely did pivot quite a bit. Some advice that I heard from Ben's channel, Rare Liquid, was to focus on being interesting rather than impressive. I thought this piece of advice was really good because I think everybody's resume is very impressive. So I wanted to include things that weren't on my resume or I couldn't share on my resume, such as, childhood stories and things like that, or maybe color in some more details as to, what was behind that one line item on my resume. I also thought about what things I wanted to share. Obviously, I wanted to talk about my job because it's not a traditional role by any means. I wanted to be very clear about what I would bring to the table and what my experience was. I think that if you have a traditional business background, you may not have to talk about your job that much, but because mine was, I guess, very out of the ordinary for the applicant pool, I wanted to let the admissions committee know exactly what I did and why it was important for business. Another thing I wanted the admissions committee to know about me was my love of cats, hence the name of this channel. I know it seems pretty random and a little bit minor, but truly that is what I am known for. Everybody knows that I love cats and I volunteer at a shelter. And when I was 10, I even wrote a contract to get my parents to adopt a cat for us. So cats are very core to my interests, very close to my heart, and I was going to find a way to include cats into my essays. And lastly, when I thought about leadership, I remembered the be interesting, not impressive advice, because I think a lot of people have very robust leadership experience on their resume. So I wanted mine to be poignant. I wanted it to be relevant. I wanted it to kind of like tug at heartstrings, because I think if you can elicit an emotional response, you can be memorable. And that's what I want it to be. So I thought about the different leadership positions I had and I crossed those off the list. If it had a title, I crossed it off the list because, titles don't really mean anything. I wanted a story that could show my character and show my leadership rather than just have it be assumed by a title, because oftentimes assumptions are wrong. And I feel like if an admissions committee just looks at a bunch of titles, it's actually a little bit meaningless. So I talked about this time when I moved to a really remote area for my job for 3 to 4 months, and I found a local church and they didn't have a youth pastor. So I decided that I would step in and mentor the youth kids for those few months. So I think that really showed, initiative. It showed that I cared, and it showed that even though it was a very short period of time, I knew I could make an impact. So now that I had these three things I wanted to talk about, my job as a robotics innovation engineer, my love for cats, and the time I stepped up to volunteer at a youth group, I had to find a common thread to like tie them all together to, create a brand for myself and to make my application make sense. So after a lot of writing, after a lot of reflection, I realized that all of three of these things have an underlying theme, and that theme is to help people and animals. So for example, for my robotics job, we are, taking people out of harm's way. We're not trying to replace their jobs, we're trying to augment their jobs. So instead of doing confined space entries with the risk of asphyxiation and contact with, toxic chemicals, we are sending robots to do that instead. And instead of elevated work with a risk of falling, we're sending drones and other, crawlers, magnetic crawlers to do that work instead. And instead of industrial cleaning, we are sending industrial cleaning robots to go vacuum up that disgusting chemical sludge, right? And that doesn't mean there's no human in the process. That just means that the human is controlling the robot rather than actually doing the maintenance or inspection work item. So it overall makes the person's life better, it makes it safer, and improves, the quality of work as well. And then for cats, that's pretty self-explanatory. I volunteer at a shelter and I help these fur babies find their forever homes. I, help match them with people that I think will love them as much as they deserve to be loved. And that changes their life forever, not just for the cat, but I also think for the person. And then lastly, for volunteering at the youth group, I, mentored these 20 kids. And this place didn't have a lot of resources because it was remote. So I was able to be that resource for the kids. Talked about, standardized testing and what majors there were available, and it really warms my heart now because a lot of them have graduated in the majors that we chose together. So I'd like to think that I did make an impact in their life and, at least pointed them in the right direction. Speaking of standardized testing, I took the GRE before I graduated from undergrad. I figured that that was as smart as I was ever going to be, so I would just take it just in case I decided to go to grad school. I took the GRE because I didn't know which type of grad school I wanted to go to, and it just so happened that I chose business school and my score was going to expire in a few months. So it all worked out. And then as for recommendation letters, like I mentioned before, I talked to my leader and one of my mentors who gave me those two pieces of advice. So I went back to them and I asked them if they would write the rec letters for me. Since I only had a month, they only had a month. So they're really troopers for doing that, and I cannot thank them enough for their guidance and for actually supporting me in the application process. I didn't do too much. I just gave them my resume and my past 2 or 3 years of performance reviews, as well as, a write up of all the major projects and the impact that they had. And I kind of just let them do whatever. I didn't have enough time to manage the rec letters, so I just crossed my fingers and trusted that it was going to be good. So yeah, that's how I wrote my HBS application in just 1 month. It's a fast turnaround, but it's definitely possible. I hope this is encouraging to all applicants, whether or not you are applying to HBS or not. And like I said before, I was inspired to reveal my essays at some point, so I'll do that in the next video. So subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time.